Hello, ladies and gentlemen, from Gwynedd Mercy University. This is Dr. Dunn, and as you know, we have a snow day today, so classes are being held virtually. So as I said in my email that I sent out, I would be recording a lecture on my computer, which I would then upload to YouTube for you to watch at your own convenience. So I hope all of you are doing well. Whoops, that's the cat. Sorry. In and out, in and out. Just can't decide whether she wants to be in or out. Come here, Zoe. Come here. Come here. Come here, baby. Nope, she doesn't want to come. Maybe she'll come over later and I can pick her up and show you to her. Anyways, so as I said, this is a lecture that I'll be putting up on YouTube. I hope you're all doing well during the snowstorm, that you're enjoying yourself, hopefully maybe relaxing a little bit, or maybe you're studying as well for classes. I don't know. But anyways, so let's get into it. We're talking about Jesus' ministry and teaching, and I have the PowerPoint up on the screen as you can see, and we will start with the class lecture. Let's get to the PowerPoint slide that we want. Yes, there was, before I forget, there was a question by one of the students in class about whether Jesus was sodomized as part of his humiliation before the crucifixion. And I did do some looking into that, and I will address that at the next class. I don't want to address it now, but I just want to mention it before I forget about it. But yes, I do have some information on it that I can tell the class. We were talking about the crucifixion, and I'll pass over this. But what were the reasons? Let me get my notes here. We talked about the reasons for why Jesus died. And as I said, we don't really know. I went over some of the reasons why the Jewish leadership thought that Jesus should die, at least as it's told in the Gospels, which are still pretty much our best historical records for the life and ministry of Jesus, even though technically they're not necessarily histories. The fact that Jesus is claiming to be a Messiah, what is the Messiah? Let me look at my thing. Okay. Actually, I give you the definition here, and just to repeat, it was a king savior. It was someone who would be a descendant of this ancient king named David, who would restore the kingdom of Israel, the kingdom that the Jews once had, would defeat the enemies of Israel, and would establish a reign of peace amongst the Jews based on the perfect or the faithful following of God's law, which was given through the lawgiver Moses. So that's what some people were expecting during the time of Jesus. But when I talk about who is Jesus or who was Jesus, I'll talk more in depth about this idea of the Messiah. But this was something that was controversial amongst the Jewish leadership, that he was claiming to be this Messiah or Christ. But it certainly would have been controversial with the Romans as well. We ended, I think, with reading from this passage from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 14, and this is from the trial of Jesus. And since Mark is the earliest of the Gospels, as we'll learn in a later class, but Mark, just so you know, the Gospel of Mark is believed by scholars to have been written first out of the four Gospels, and it contains early traditions of Jesus. You know, that doesn't mean the other Gospels don't also contain early traditions of Jesus, just as they were written down later. Nevertheless, this is what scholars and historians would believe to be our earliest account from a Christian perspective of the trial of Jesus and why, it gives us some inkling, some idea of why he might have been crucified. Okay, so I'm just going to go over this and point out some things that are of interest to me and hopefully will be of interest to you. So Jesus is brought before this council called the Sanhedrin, a council of the religious leadership, but also a council of elders, people who were respected individuals in the community. And so he was brought before the council to be judged. And they brought in witnesses to judge him, to bring evidence against him. And at one point, witnesses get up and testify falsely, according to Mark, that we heard Jesus say, "I will destroy this temple, and within 3 days I will build another temple." Now, I mentioned in class, I believe, that this is an interesting comment because nowhere in the Gospel of Mark does Jesus actually say this. Mark never records this. In fact, I believe the only place that it occurs is in the Gospel of John, which is one of the later Gospels. Let me get this for you here. Move myself out of the way. Get to my Bible. Online Bible. The Gospel of John. And it's in, I believe, the 3rd chapter, if I remember correctly. No, it's not in the 3rd chapter. Is it in the, when Jesus goes to the temple? There we are. It's in the 2nd chapter. Excuse me. Jesus goes to the temple in this famous scene, which is recounted in all the Gospels, that Jesus goes to the temple and he cleanses the temple. He's outraged by the practices that are going on there, the business practices that are going on in the temple, and he believes that it's turning the temple from place of prayer into basically a marketplace. He also might have been annoyed or disturbed by some of the unjust practices that were going on with the money changers, where they apparently would not exchange money, coin for coin. They would actually have different money rates or different scales, and so that might have been considered unjust. So Jesus when he goes to the temple, he is enraged. I shouldn't say enraged, that's too strong a word, but he's angered by this, and he drives these people out. Those who, as you can see here, Jesus found in the temple area those who were selling oxen and sheep and doves and the money changers, and he made a whip and he drove them all out of the temple area and he threw over their tables. Okay. And the Jews, the people who are in the temple, respond to Jesus basically, why are you doing this? The Jews answered and said to him, what sign can you show us for doing this? What is your right to do this? Well, are you a prophet or something? What are you? And Jesus responds by saying, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And the Jews respond, this temple has been under construction for 46 years, and you will raise it up in 3 days? Okay? And that's an interesting detail. It shows John, even though a lot of historians and biblical scholars don't think John is a very historical gospel, I think it is. And I think a lot of biblical scholars and New Testament scholars have begun to appreciate the historical accuracy of John's gospel, because this is a true detail. This is actually accurate. The temple, they didn't say the temple has been here for 46 years. They say it's been under construction. And that was true. At the time of Jesus, the temple was being renovated. It started under Herod the Great, whom I mentioned before, and it still had not been completed by the time of Jesus. In fact, it wasn't completed until many years after Jesus had left the scene. So that's interesting. So they're saying this temple has been under construction for so long, and you're going to destroy it, and you're going to just build it back up in 3 days, although it's taken us almost 50 years to build and rebuild and renovate this temple. Or actually, they weren't rebuilding it. They were renovating the temple. Now, John tells us that Jesus was speaking about his body and being raised from the dead. And this will come into play later, because it says, therefore, when Jesus was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they came to believe the scripture and the word Jesus had spoken. So it's mentioned here in the Gospel of John. It's not mentioned in the Gospel of Mark. So that's an interesting detail. But the fact that Jesus made what people thought was an attack on the temple, the place where God resided amongst the people of Israel, the house of God where God lived amongst men. This was a serious thing. This was a very serious thing to do that could get you killed and could get you the death penalty, at least amongst the Jews, because it was, an attack on God himself, his holy place. Now, the Romans might have also wanted to kill Jesus for this, because if it were true, it would make Jesus out to be like a revolutionary, like he wants to destroy everything and overturn everything. And the Romans were not about that. The Romans wanted order. They wanted, even amongst their conquered peoples, they wanted control, of course, but they wanted order. They wanted everything to be as it should be. People pay their taxes, they work their jobs, they live their lives, whatever. They didn't want disruption. Okay? So someone who's going to disrupt everything by destroying this building within the city of the Jews, Jerusalem, this important building, that might have even gotten the attention of the Romans. and may have led to Jesus' execution. But anyway, so this was, this was a major charge against Jesus, that he had attacked the temple. So the high priest gets up and questions Jesus, and Jesus doesn't say anything. So the high priest says to him, now in the other Gospels, I believe it's the Gospel of Matthew, but I'd have to go check. I'm forgetting. Actually, I should got my Bible here, so I could just go check. I believe it's the Gospel of Matthew where the high priest places Jesus under oath before God. Let me just see this. Yes, okay. In the Gospel of Matthew, this is in chapter 26. Verse 63, the high priest said to him, I order you to tell us under oath before the living God whether you are the Christ, the Son of God. Okay, so in Matthew, it's the high priest, and his account really lays it on the line and kind of constrains Jesus to give an answer, because he's placing him under oath before God to tell the truth. In Mark's gospel, he just says, the high priest asks Jesus, are you the Messiah, the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? And this is interesting in a way, because notice that he doesn't say the Son of God, and that was Jewish practice. It's Jewish practice certainly not to mention the name of God, but oftentimes Jews, even today, will not even say God, or will not write out the word God out of respect for God. So they have ways of talking around this. They call God the name, Hashem, or here they call him the Blessed One. Okay, but it's the same thing. Are you the Christ, the Son of God? And Jesus says, I am. I am. And then he continues, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power, i.e. God, namely God, and coming with the clouds of heaven. There are several things to say about this short statement of Jesus. First of all, you might just say, well, he admits it. He says, I am. Okay, and that's it. But there's more to it than that, because I am also, it's kind of a double entendre here. There's a double meaning going on here. I am can also mean yes, I am. He's affirming it. I am the Messiah. But I am was also the name of God. And we'll talk about this more later when we talk about who was Jesus, because there seem to be times in the Gospel of Mark, but especially in the Gospel of John, where Jesus applies the very name that the Jews have learned from God to himself. And this name is I am. In long form, it's I am who am. And when when God appears to the great prophet and lawgiver Moses, way back in the book of Exodus in the Bible, and Moses asks for the name of God, tell me your name so I can give it to the Jews when I go to them, so they'll listen to me. God says, tell them I am sent you. So there seems to be a double meaning going on here. Why do I believe that? Because we'll see below. Look at below this statement. But I'll get to that in a moment. Jesus calls himself the Son of Man. You will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power. This statement, this title, the Son of Man, may have been a messianic title, may have been another name for the Messiah amongst Jews in the first century. That's another thing we'll talk about later when we talk about who was Jesus. But the fact that Jesus applies what could be a messianic title to himself, as well as a divine title, is very significant here. The Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power. Notice Jesus does not say God. He calls him the power. So kind of a workaround instead of saying God. And also notice that Jesus, who appears to identify himself as the Son of Man, will be seated at God's right hand. Not beneath God, on God's side. Okay, this is interesting because we know this from later Jewish tradition, which may have been true at the time of Jesus, but there was the Jewish belief that no one sat in God's presence in heaven. All the angels, everybody would stand in God's presence. Only God sits on a throne. No one else sits. Well, with one exception, but I'm not going to talk about him. But here, Jesus portrays himself as one who sits in God's presence as if he is God, and next to God at God's right hand as if he is equal to God. And then he concludes, the Son of Man will come with the clouds of heaven. Now, what does Jesus mean by that? Does he mean the end of the world? Does Jesus think the end of the world is coming now with his death? We don't know. Later Christian interpretation, I think, would say that Jesus is talking about his second coming, because Jesus doesn't come on the clouds of heaven then, right at that point in time. Some New Testament scholars would argue that Jesus is talking about somebody else who would come, this other Son of Man, not him, who would come with the clouds of heaven. Is a possible interpretation, but that's not the general interpretation that we might have. We can also interpret it as a future coming of Jesus when he's glorified. At that, the high priest tore his garments and said, "What further need have we of witnesses? You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" And they all condemned Jesus as deserving death. Now, this is also a Jewish practice. When you hear something that is terrible, like a blasphemy, but also like the death of a close friend or something like that, or someone you love, or just something awful, you would tear open your cloak or your clothes to show your grief, or to show your anger, or whatever. And but notice what the high priest says. He charges Jesus with blasphemy. Okay, that's the charge. And we had a definition of blasphemy before, which is to speak disrespectfully about the sacred or about the divine, to offend God. But how does Jesus offend God? Because even Jews today, Jews who don't accept Jesus, obviously, would say this makes no sense. To claim you're the Christ, the Messiah, was not blasphemous. Because for Jews, then as well as now, they were not expecting a godlike Messiah. They did not believe that the Messiah, the Christ, was to be God in any sort of way. So how is this an offense against God to say, I am the Messiah? Whether Jesus was or not is another question. Even to call himself the Son of the Blessed One does not necessarily mean he was a divine being, because the kings of the Jews were called sons of God. They were like adopted family members of God. So Jesus could have meant that. That could be the high priest probably meant that in a metaphorical sense. Seating himself at the right hand of the power, that could be considered blasphemous. Making himself in some way equal to God. But I think that the kicker is really that Jesus calls himself I am and applies the name of God to himself. And so that's where the blasphemy comes in. And for that, there was definite death amongst the Jews. It says it in the law. If you blaspheme God, you shall be put to death. Now, that was death deserving amongst the Jews, but the Jews did not have the power to crucify. They did not have the power to exact capital punishment because the Romans were in control. So let's look here at a few of the evidences of what they tell Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, is their charge against Jesus and why he has to die. Okay, we get a little inside view with Mark in the trial, where Mark, Jesus is blasphemed. That's the thing that seems to bring about the judgment of death against him. Hold on a second here. Come here. Here we go. Here she is. Zoe Kitty. She wants to go in, she wants to go out. She wants to go in, she wants to go out. Yes, she's a black cat from her nose to her tail. I know you gotta go out. Okay. Go out. But I'm not letting you back in. I'm closing the door. So she just has to stay out from now on. Okay. So we have here a statement from the Gospel of Luke chapter 23. Then the whole assembly of them, the Sanhedrin, arose and brought Jesus before Pilate. They brought charges against him, saying, "We found this man misleading our people." They don't say that's how he's misleading, but they're going to say, "He opposes the payment of taxes to Caesar and maintains that he is the Christ, a king." Okay? Now that would have been death deserving for the Romans, okay, in two ways. First of all, again, the payment of taxes to Caesar, whenever money is involved in any sort of government, that's a big issue. If you defraud the IRS or you defraud the government of your taxes, the IRS will come after you full force. So even today, opposing the payment of taxes is a major issue and can get you into court and possibly into jail. So they bring this issue up to Pontius Pilate because this would get his attention. Oh, he's saying people shouldn't pay taxes to Caesar. That is kind of an attack on the Emperor Caesar, who at this time was Tiberius. But more than that, they add the fact that Jesus maintains that he is also a king like Caesar. So now he's a rival. So this is treasonous. And so this claim to be a Messiah, this king figure, would have been very significant for Pontius Pilate and would have deserved, if true, would have deserved a judgment of death against Jesus. We find these two charges of blasphemy and the political charge. So we have a religious charge of blasphemy, but we also have a political charge of claiming to be a king and rival to Caesar, coming together in the Gospel of John. He kind of conflates and brings together these two charges. So in the Gospel of John, chapter 19, when the Sanhedrin brings Jesus before Pilate, notice what happens. So they bring Jesus to Pilate. Pilate is not sure what to do with Jesus or if there's any charge against Jesus according to John. Nevertheless, he does have Jesus whipped, and Jesus is brought out during the process of whipping Jesus, the soldiers also mock Jesus. They put a purple cloak, and purple was a sign. It was a very expensive kind of garment. If you could dye a garment purple, it was very expensive because it was so hard to do. It's kind of interesting about making purple dye in the ancient world. You had to use pee. The only way they could get the right color is that they had to use like human urine. Or maybe animal urine, but I believe also human urine, just to get that right color. So I don't know if purple garments actually smelled very good, but they looked great. You know what I'm saying? So only like the very rich and the emperors the rulers would wear these colors. So to wear purple, this color, could also be considered treasonous. But in the case of Jesus, it's mocking him. The soldiers know that there's this claim that he is a king figure, so they mock him by giving him a purple cloak like a king. They also give him a crown made out of thorns to mock Jesus. And so Pilate is brought out before the crowd of Jews, of people who were in Jerusalem, and he says, "Look at the man, behold the man." And when the chief priests and the guards saw him, they cried out, "Crucify him, crucify him, give him death," But Pilate said, to them, take him yourselves and crucify him. I find no guilt in him. Just kind of an empty statement because Pilate knew they couldn't take Jesus and crucify him because they had no legal power to do that. But Pilate is saying, I don't see what your problem is with this guy, Take him yourself. I've whipped him to show him who's in control, so maybe if he is a rabble-rouser, he won't get uppity anymore. But, does he deserve death? However, the Jews answered, the crowd of people answered, "We have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God." So here we have the religious charge of blasphemy. Jesus is making himself God. Here in the Gospel of John, as opposed to what might be the meaning in the Gospel of Mark, John assumes Son of God is literal, that when it's not just a title or a name for the kings of Israel, for the kings of the Jews. It is more than that. In Jesus' case, it's literal. Jesus truly is derived from God. He is divine. So the meaning has shifted. And because Jesus is claiming to be the Son of God, that's blasphemy. He's claiming to be divine, which according to the law of the Jews meant death, because it was blasphemy, but also it broke the first commandment, which says that, you shall have no other God besides the one God. Only him shall you worship. So you have this religious charge. And if you read the story, I didn't have you read the story, but just to tell you, Pilate doesn't know what to make of this. Okay, Pilate is a pagan, so Pilate believes in gods and goddesses, and probably knew the stories that some of the gods became human. They had sex with human women and produced kind of half human, half god hybrids. And it's interesting that he brings Jesus back into the building, and the first thing he says to Jesus is, "Where are you from?" Now, I mean, I don't think he's asking like, where are you from? Are you from Galilee? Where are you from? You're from Nazareth in Galilee? I think he's like, does he have a semi-divine figure here? And he's like, ask, where are you from? Are you from earth or are you from heaven? But anyways, now we have the second charge. Consequently, Pilate tried to release Jesus, but the Jews cried out, "If you release Jesus, you are not a friend of Caesar. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." So here we have the political charge coming into play. This title, Friend of Caesar, is historical. This was a title that was given out by the Roman government to certain people to kind of show that they were best buddies of Caesar. They had done, Caesar liked them. So it was kind of an honorary title. I don't know if they got any benefit from it other than being able to call themselves a friend of Caesar, but nevertheless. So Pilate, at least according to the Gospel of John, had this title of a friend of Caesar for whatever reason, whatever he did. But you're not a friend of Caesar if you support this Jesus, because he's saying he's a king. And a king is a rival. This king, as a king, he would be a rival of Caesar. He would be treasonous. So that's the political charge. Jesus, whatever statements Jesus may have made or may not have made, we do know that there seemed to be a belief that Jesus claimed to be the Messiah, or that some people believe that Jesus was claiming to be the Messiah or a king. For the Romans, that was a good enough reason to execute him, if he was indeed claiming this. And we see this in the gospel accounts. We see this in Luke, where it's brought up immediately by the Sanhedrin, and we see this in John, where it's kind of like the final argument against Jesus that kind of gets Pilate's attention. And all of the accounts in the Gospels, both in the three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and the Gospel of John, show that Pilate's chief concern in the trial is to know if Jesus were claiming to be a king. And in every Gospel, this question comes up. In every Gospel, Pilate asks Jesus directly, "Are you the King of the Jews?" In other words, are you claiming this? And Jesus, in some way, seems to indicate this to Pilate. He seems to indicate that, yes, I am claiming this. If that's the case, then that would have been treason, and Pilate seems to be convinced of this because he does hand Jesus over to be executed by crucifixion. And in fact, the charge on the cross in all of the Gospels make a point of giving the charge on the cross of the crime for which Jesus was being executed, and they all say, "Jesus, King of the Jews," in one way or another. Each one gives it a little bit differently. But basically it says, "Jesus, the King of the Jews." So that's why Jesus was being crucified. This is a picture I thought I would show you because in 2001, archaeologists were digging in what used to be a prison, a modern prison, or maybe it was a medieval prison. But anyways, a prison in Jerusalem. It was used as a prison. But as they were digging deeper and deeper, they came to the foundations of what they believed to be Herod's palace in Jerusalem, the palace of Herod the Great, which was also used as the praetorium of Pontius Pilate. The praetorium, it's hard to define what a praetorium was. A praetorium seems to have been basically a tent where the general of an army would live with the soldiers while they were in battle or while they were stationed somewhere. And then it became the name for the building in which the leader or the governor of the Romans in a province or an area would live. And so this is where, when Pontius Pilate was in Jerusalem, this is where he would be stationed. This is where he would have his headquarters. It was called the Praetorium. He did not live in Jerusalem. He actually, the actual capital for the Roman governor or prefect in Judea Judea, in the province of Palestine. Judea was on the coast, in I believe the city of Caesarea. But anyways, in 2001 they dug down, they found the foundations, which you can see here in the picture. So I'm showing you these foundations. So we have what seems to be the location of the Praetorium, which is where the trial of Jesus took place. So we have some archaeological evidence for the Praetorium and Herod's palace, and also in general, because it's been built over so many times, as you can see. We at least have the foundations of this building where the actual trial of Jesus of Nazareth occurred. Interesting. Nevertheless, the story does not end there. A few days after Jesus' death, some of his followers claimed that they had actually seen him bodily alive again. Actually, not mystically seen him, and bodily alive, not just spiritually reborn. Okay, and this belief, this claim of Christianity is called the resurrection. Sorry, I'm just checking my time. I want to make sure how I'm doing on time, because I think, anyways. The resurrection is the name for the Christian belief that the dead body of Jesus of Nazareth was raised back to life by God. It comes from the Latin word resurgo, which means to raise up again, or to literally to lift up again. Like, think of surge, something that surges, you know, in English. Let me change this because the O should just be an O. It doesn't have to have that macron over it. Okay. Oops, turn my page here. See, let me go to my other notes here because I'm beyond this. Okay, so this happened several days after the crucifixion of Jesus. The dead body had been taken down and buried, and then several days later, people started saying that they had physically seen Jesus again, alive. The resurrection changed everything. By raising Jesus bodily from the dead, God had glorified him and had confirmed Jesus' claims to be both Lord and Messiah. And we'll see this this is from your readings. You were supposed to have read Acts of the Apostles chapter 2, which contains a sermon by St. Peter the Apostle, in which he says that basically that by raising Jesus from the dead, he is now Lord and Christ. This confirms these things. Now, whether anyone believed this while Jesus was alive, it's not clear. There seems to be confusion in the record. People don't always understand what Jesus is claiming about himself or what he is. Okay, but the resurrection changes everything. Whatever Christ's followers thought about him before, that he was just a prophet, that he was a rabbi, a Jewish religious teacher, that he was a miracle worker, that he was the Messiah, the Christ, or even if they thought he was a failure, he was a good man who just was in the wrong place at the wrong time, he got himself killed, they could no longer understand him that way after the resurrection. All that Jesus said and did, especially his messianic actions and statements, even his apparent claims to divinity, seemed now to make sense, to be understandable in the light of the resurrection. The empty tomb. I'll talk about that in a moment. Remember, the whole New Testament, and the earliest Christian writings, and all of Christianity really, point in the same direction, the death and the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. The man, Jesus, who has saved humankind from sin by his death on the cross, has been glorified by God by being raised bodily from the dead. The resurrection is a confirmation, because the crucifixion is not a confirmation. The crucifixion, if anything, is a tragedy. It's the reverse. It shows Jesus as a failure. Okay? Jesus dies on the cross. Obviously, if he's dead, he can't be the Messiah anymore. So he doesn't reestablish the kingdom of David. He doesn't bring about the end of the world. None of this happens. It seems like everything is lost. It's a complete failure. The resurrection confirms that it's not a complete failure. The disciples, let's say some things that might be obvious, but maybe they're not so obvious, but I want to say them anyways because of that fact. The disciples were not claiming, and this, even sometimes you'll hear this amongst Christians, usually of a more liberal variety, but that's okay, they're Christians. The disciples were not claiming a spiritual rebirth. They were not claiming, for example, that, the dead Jesus had just been glorified by God, not really physically raised. He'd just been spiritually glorified by God and was now in heaven. That's not what they were claiming. They were saying that Jesus had appeared bodily to them again. He was physically raised. They were not claiming that it was some sort of mystical experience of Jesus, as sometimes you'll hear some New Testament scholars claim this, that it was a mystical experience. They're willing to grant that the disciples saw something. These disciples that were claiming that they saw Jesus saw something. But some people don't really rise from the dead. They couldn't have seen the real Jesus, so they say it was a mystical experience that was, brought on by the stress of grief. Jesus' distraught followers lovingly remembered their Lord. And in that kind of stress, they felt like they had a feeling, or maybe even a hallucination, of Jesus. And so they started saying, "We have seen the Lord." The problem with that is that his followers, even the apostles, the ones closest to Jesus, had lost their faith in Jesus due to the crucifixion. When this group of women in the stories, and you know this from the Gospel of Mark, a group of women led by a woman named St. Mary Magdalene, go to the tomb on supposedly Sunday morning, but several days later, okay, so let's say Sunday morning, that's the traditional day. They did not expect a resurrection. They were going back because they had not been able to anoint the body. They didn't have enough time between taking Jesus off the cross and putting him in the tomb, and then the Sabbath came, so they can't work on the Sabbath. Jews can't work on the Sabbath, and so can't Christians. But they couldn't work, so they couldn't anoint the body. There were burial customs that the Jews had where different spices and stuff and oils would be applied to the body to anoint the body because the body was sacred because it was created by God. They couldn't do that. They were coming back to do that on Sunday morning. So they were expecting a corpse, not a resurrection. They were there to anoint a dead body as per their burial customs. They were not expecting a resurrection, which means they didn't have faith in it. They didn't believe it was going to happen. So a mystical experience brought on by the stress of grief, well, maybe, it's possible. But they didn't believe in Jesus, a lot of them, anymore. And then we have the empty tomb. They were not claiming an empty tomb. Their cry was not, "We have seen an empty tomb and it's empty." Their cry was, "We have seen, actually, physically, the Lord." And this is let's take a look at our reading from the Gospel of Mark for a moment. Hopefully you've read the Gospel of Mark, okay? And we come to the end of the Gospel of Mark, okay? And this tells us, the Sabbath was over. Mary Magdalene, another Mary, who is the mother of James, although this could be two people. It could be a Mary and then another person called the mother of James, whose name we don't know, and Salome. So we have a number of women come to go and anoint the body. And an angel, and they come to the tomb. And when they come to the tomb, they see that the stone has been rolled away from the entrance to the tomb. And they go into the tomb and they see a young man who turns out to, people believe is an angel. It just says a young man. And usually that's kind of code for angel in the writings. So they see an angel in a white robe and they're astonished. And he says to them, "Don't be astonished, don't be amazed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, the crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Behold, the place where they laid him." So he shows them, look, this is where the body was. You can obviously see it's not here anymore. "But go and tell his disciples and Peter, he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him as he told you." Okay, and the women exit the tomb and flee. They actually go running away from the tomb, seized with trembling and bewilderment, and they say nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Okay, so this is the story of the empty tomb. This is in all the Gospels. The disciples find an empty tomb several days later, and they don't know what to make of it. They don't know what to make of it. It has to be explained to these women, these disciples of Jesus. The angel has to explain to them what's going on. Remember, they were not expecting a resurrection. And this is the end of Mark's Gospel. You might notice here the title in your New American Bible Revised Edition, the longer ending, and see that the story continues, okay? But actually, biblical scholars believe, and they're probably right based on the evidence, based on the way the Greek is written, that the original Gospel of Mark ends here in verse 8, because he ends mid-sentence. It's almost as if you translated this, "They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." If you wanted to kind of capture what Mark does in the Greek, you would translate it this way. "They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid that ... and then the reader's like, "That what?" Because the word "that" in English, normally in a sentence like in that case, used in that sense, means that there's another clause about to come, but there's nothing there. So you're like, "That what?" They were afraid that what would happen to them? Well, what's going on here? And that's how Mark ends it in the Greek, more or less, okay? It's not exactly reproducible in English, but I've kind of reproduced it for you. So he ends in mid-sentence. So what happened to the rest of the ending of Mark's Gospel? We don't know. Scholars theorize and debate and argue. We just don't know. I wasn't there. And then later on, somebody added all these extra verses of appearances of the risen Jesus, which is still part of the Gospel, except for the shorter ending, which actually should not be there. That's hold on a second here. Which is a mistake in your NABRE, because the shorter ending is not accepted by the church as canonical, so I don't know why it's there in the New American Bible. But anyways, they have all these different little stories about Jesus, extra stories about Jesus, but it actually ends with verse 8, with the empty tomb. So Mark's Gospel ends with the empty tomb. And all the Gospels have this story of the empty tomb. Now, the empty tomb is not an argument for the resurrection. And you say, well, how can that be? That the tomb was empty? What else could it mean? Well, think about what we just read here in the Gospel of Mark. The women who were followers of Jesus didn't think it meant a resurrection. So the fact that the body wasn't there and that the tomb was empty did not indicate to them immediately that Jesus had been raised from the dead. Hallelujah. In fact, the angel has to explain it to them. He even has to show them, he has to tell them he has been raised. Okay, so they weren't expecting that. So, I mean, the fact that there's an empty tomb doesn't have a lot of probative value, because there are other explanations for the empty tomb. What are some of the explanations for the empty tomb? Well, the first explanation is that they went to the wrong place, the wrong tomb. They forgot in their haste of where they buried Jesus. And the fact that there weren't a lot of people present at the place where Jesus was buried. When these women came back to the tomb, they misremembered where Jesus was buried. Jesus was buried someplace else, and they just came back to an empty tomb where no one had been buried. Okay? That's a possibility, that it was the wrong tomb. That's a possible explanation of why these women would have found an empty tomb. And then they had to explain why it was empty. Oh, Jesus was raised. Eventually the Christians decided Jesus was raised, but it could have been the wrong tomb. That's possible. It's not very likely. because some of these women, like St. Mary Magdalene, were said to have been witnesses of where the tomb of Jesus was. But, that's a claim that sometimes people make against the resurrection. That's one claim. Another claim is that they stole the body. Yeah, they went to the right tomb, but some disciples, for whatever reason, came back later and they stole the body of Jesus. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they stole it to prove the resurrection, because for a number of reasons. The first reason is that from the Gospels, from what we understand, the disciples didn't seem to understand what Jesus even meant by resurrection from the dead. So how were they even expecting it? Okay, they didn't seem to have. Oh, get out of here! Sorry about that. They didn't seem to have, a full understanding of what when Jesus talked about being raised from the dead or coming back from the dead. It didn't enter their minds as Jews what this actually meant for them. It was still a very early idea within Judaism. It was a late idea that developed within Judaism, and it was an early idea in the first century. So the Gospels don't give any indication that the apostles understood. In fact, remember what we just read from the Gospel of John, where he says when Jesus talks about destroying this temple and I'll raise it up, or it will be raised. And John adds this comment, oh, you know what? He was talking about the temple of his body and the resurrection, but his disciples did not understand that at the time. They didn't know what he meant. It was only when the resurrection happened, John tells us, that they remembered that Jesus had said this. They remembered after the fact. It took the resurrection to prod their memory, and they're like, this is what he's talking about. Okay? Jesus physically here. This is what he's talking about. So the fact that some may have stolen the body to prove Jesus' statements and prophecies about that he would be raised from the dead, possible, but I don't think it's very likely given the fact that they probably weren't even expecting the resurrection from the dead. And the Gospels are honest about that they lacked understanding. Another possibility is that they stole, which is very likely, that some of his disciples stole the body in order to avoid desecration. They didn't want Jesus's body to be insulted by his enemies, that people would come to his tomb and do bad things to his body or to the tomb. So some disciples may have removed it and put it in another place so it could be honored and not be desecrated, or what's another word for desecration? I can't desecrate. I'm trying to think of another word and it's not coming into my head. I've got a thesaurus over here, but I'll use the thesaurus I have on. It'd be nice if I could spell it on my computer. To desecrate. To defile. Okay, to violate. All right, that's another word I'm looking for. To violate his corpse and stuff like that. To defile his corpse. Okay, so that might have been a concern. You also might have had the Romans actually could have stolen the body. There's a third explanation or a third kind of reason for stealing the body. The Romans could have stolen the body because they didn't want a shrine to Jesus to be built up. If Jesus was claiming to be this king, this Messiah, they didn't want Jesus to become a martyr with this shrine that people would go to and maybe start people thinking about, yeah, Jesus was the Messiah. We need to overthrow the Romans like Jesus wanted to because he was the Messiah. That wouldn't be good for the Romans. So maybe they stole the body. Who knows? In fact, in the Gospel of Matthew admits that this is the explanation that the body was stolen by the disciples. This is the explanation that a lot of Jews took or accepted as the norm, that Jesus' disciples stole the body so that they could say that Jesus was risen from the dead, that he was raised from the dead. So even Matthew in the Gospels themselves admit that the empty tomb is not in and of itself proof of the resurrection, because there are other explanations. Of course, for Matthew, he's like, we Christians know better, that Jesus did rise from the dead. What's another explanation? The wrong tomb, they stole the body. There's another explanation. Well, they made it up. This is not the majority view amongst New Testament scholars, but you will sometimes hear this on the internet by some biblical scholars, some New Testament scholars. But they're in the minority. Most New Testament scholars accept the fact that there was a tomb. That the Gospels did not just make up this story of a tomb for Jesus and then that it was empty. But some people claim this, a minority view. Some people claim that the whole story of the tomb was made up. Number one, because they wanted to give Jesus a proper burial. And Roman practice typically, according to what I'm told, I'll assume that they're correct, but Roman practice typically was not to bury the bodies of crucified men or crucified people. It was to let the bodies hang on the cross in order to decompose. It was another part of the element of shaming the person who was the criminal, but it also was a countermeasure against crime. It was meant to be a lesson to people of like, this is what will happen to you if you commit crimes against the Roman government. So they wanted to leave the bodies on there until they were completely decomposed. And so some scholars say, well, that's what happened to Jesus, because that was normal Roman practice. And so the Christians, because they couldn't deal with this very disturbing idea, they had to create the story of Jesus receiving a proper burial in a tomb. Also, the second reason would be the resurrection. For Jesus to be raised from the grave, you need a grave. So some people will argue that, they made up the story because they wanted to ultimately prove the resurrection. Jesus couldn't have been raised from a tomb if he had no tomb to have his dead body in. So the Christians made it up there. Again, this is the minority view, and it doesn't, most New Testament scholars accept the fact that the tomb of Jesus is an historical fact. It seems to be an historical datum that Jesus was buried. Why? Well, first of all, we can say that those who say, well, Christians were they created the tombs, the fact that Jesus was even buried, because they couldn't handle the fact or accept the fact that he'd been left on the cross to decompose. He had to be. You actually don't need a tomb for the resurrection story. If God could raise, in both cases, you have a dead body. Whether the dead body is on the cross for several days and raised, or it's in a place in a tomb for several days and raised. The end argument is the same. Jesus has been raised from the dead. In fact, you could it's just as plausible to say or to argue that, they could have made up the story of Jesus being glorified, his dead body being glorified on the cross and raised back to life on the cross. And then Jesus comes down from the cross, and hallelujah, here I am raised again. You don't need a tomb for the resurrection. You can get to the resurrection by another route. Just having Jesus revivified on the cross. In fact, that would prove some things. That would actually tie into the crucifixion, because when Jesus is on the cross, some of the people in the crowds mock him and say, hey, if you are the Messiah, the Son of God, come down from that cross and we'll believe in you. So, if you're a Christian, you could say, okay, we'll have it happen. Jesus will die and then he'll raise again on the cross and come down, just like you said he should. And that would be proof positive he was the Messiah, the Son of God. You don't need a tomb logically in the story to move the story to a resurrection. Okay? To say that Jesus has been raised from the dead, it doesn't necessitate that he had to have been raised from a tomb. He could have been raised back on the cross 3 days later. Raised back to life on the cross 3 days later. So, that doesn't really convince me that they made it up because they had to have a tomb story. They had to have Jesus buried for him to be raised from the dead. So that doesn't seem to be a very influential or convincing argument to me. There's something else I wanted to say about that. But maybe that's all I'll say about that. There is a fourth possibility. It happened. It happened. The fact that not that there was an empty tomb, but that people were seeing Jesus physically alive again after he had been dead. Now, how do you explain that? Again, the fact that they saw Jesus, some people can come up with different explanations. Sometimes you'll come across these on the internet. One of the most common explanations I've seen over the years is that, well, Jesus didn't really die on the cross. He just fainted. He fainted from the strain and the stress and the pain and the agony. Jesus finally fainted on the cross, and they thought he was dead. And so they took him down from the cross. And when they took him down from the cross and they buried him, but Jesus revived while he was in the tomb, and he got out of the tomb somehow. Somehow he moved this huge rock, after he had just fainted on the cross, and he had wounds in his hand, nail wounds in his hands, and he had been whipped, and he was drained of energy. But somehow he was able to still move this huge stone out of the way. But he did that, and he came out, and so that's what people were seeing. Jesus, raised from the dead. He was alive again. He had been revived. So, he hadn't really died, though. So I guess you couldn't really call it a raising from the dead. This seems very unconvincing, just because the people who make this argument don't understand the process of crucifixion and what it does. Remember, crucifixion is about asphyxiation and suffocation. You can't breathe eventually, and that's what kills you. That's what's supposed to kill you. Can a person die from shock and other things? Obviously, that's possible. But the mode of death is through suffocation. So if Jesus fainted on the cross, he lost consciousness, then he was a goner. Then he definitely was dead. Okay, because, and some of you might be able to understand this because you're studying for the medical profession, maybe nursing, maybe physical therapy, and so you know how the body works. And when a person suffocates, the oxygen is cut off from the body, but especially the brain, and the brain cannot survive without oxygen for minutes, not a long time, a few minutes. Once you reach that threshold of a few minutes without oxygen, parts of the brain start to die. And that's just what happens. So now, can you revive a person who has suffocated, who has stopped breathing? Yes, it happens all the time. People do it all the time. They perform CPR. They perform mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. They bring people back all the time. But when it's been too long, over the several-minute threshold of oxygen being denied to the brain, the person comes back usually in a vegetative state, from which they almost never recover, because the brain is too damaged. The body might still be living. The heart might get the heart pumping again, and the person might even be breathing, but their brain is complete toast. It's destroyed from the lack of oxygen, and it's not going to come back because the nerve cells of the brain do not regenerate like other cells in the body. They're the only cells of the body that do not regenerate. So when you lose brain cells, you lose them forever. That's one of the problems of aging and Alzheimer's. You just don't get these things back. So if Jesus fainted on the cross, then, as I said, he was a goner. Certainly, could he have revived all on his own in the tomb? Possible, I guess, medically possible. He would not have been the same Jesus. He would have been a vegetable. He would have been in a vegetative state, most likely, if we understand medicine to be what it is and biology to be what it is. So that's probably, not a very convincing argument. That would have been like the last thing you would want Jesus to happen, to faint. Because then you were definitely, you were going to die. You were going to suffocate because you wouldn't be breathing, and the weight of your body would not allow you to breathe, and then that would cut off oxygen to the brain. So some people say that, but let's say it happened. People actually were physically seeing Jesus just as they said. They were telling the truth. For me, and it's not just because I'm a Christian and I've been a believer my whole life, but because I wrestle with these things and I wonder about them, and I go over all these other explanations myself and think about them. And I keep coming back to the resurrection because it's the only thing that really explains the weirdness and the goofiness of the gospel stories. Because what you have with the gospel stories of the resurrection is like total confusion. There's not this very, story that's just laid out logically. It all makes sense, and as if you would expect. No, from the beginning with the Gospel of Mark, and if you compare the Gospel of Mark with Matthew and Luke and John, we have the same story. Jesus is risen from the dead. It is physically appearing to people, but none of the Gospels can offer an explanation as to what this is or why, how it's happening. They simply have to believe it because they're experiencing it. And they could have easily said that, oh, this was just some spiritual experience. That was totally another plausible explanation. They could have said, Jesus died, but he's been raised up into heaven with God and now sits with God in heaven glorified. You didn't need a resurrection to make that argument. You could have still argued that, Jesus was exalted in heaven. He was lifted up into heaven, and we've seen him. We have had visions of him, as some Christians do. Like St. Paul, like St. Stephen in Acts of the Apostles. They don't see the physical risen Jesus. They see visions of him glorified. So you didn't need a body. You didn't need to make this. My point is, you didn't need to make the specific claim of a bodily resurrection to still confirm Jesus as the Messiah and the Son of God and as someone to be venerated. So the story, it doesn't, when you read the story, they don't make sense. These people don't believe in the resurrection. They're totally confused by seeing Jesus, and they don't believe it, by the way. They don't believe it, and the Gospels are completely honest about that. I mean, these were not dumb people. They were as skeptical as we are today. They wanted proof. And even when they had the proof in front of them, the risen Jesus, some of them still were in doubt about what this meant, what they were seeing. They knew people could hallucinate. They knew people could have visions. So it was completely, it was logical for them to say, is this what I'm having? Is this what's going on? It was only their continued, Jesus basically has to prove it to them. What happens is Jesus has to appear to people and more people and the right people and say, here, touch me. Look at the physical wounds where they used to kill me. Okay? Give me something to eat. Let me show you that I'm the same Jesus, even though he's different. The risen Jesus is not exactly the same. For one thing, he'll never die again. He's beyond life and death. Okay, but so he's different, but he wants to show them, look, this is not, I'm not a ghost, I'm not a vision, I'm the same Jesus that you walked around with for three some years during my ministry, okay, but I'm different now, I've been raised. And another thing to point out is that, let me get my thought back again. I'm losing my thought, or I lost my thought. I had a thought that came in my head that they still had to understand what the resurrection meant, even after they saw Jesus. And we'll see this when we talk about who was Jesus, and we look at some of the earliest writings, Christian writings we have that talk about Jesus. We still see this kind of, what does the resurrection mean? What does it mean? We experienced it, Jesus physically, but how do we interpret this? Because it really made no sense. God doesn't work like this. As someone, as one person I heard argue who doesn't believe in the resurrection, he's a New Testament scholar, but he said, does God bend or break the laws of physics? Generally, no. So you're telling me that for this one man in history, God broke the laws of physics? Well, first of all, the laws of physics are not as law-like as we like to think, because if you ever study quantum physics, and I'm not a physicist, but I like to I like to read about science, but the laws of physics don't operate the same way on the micro level as they do on the macro level, and this puzzles the heck out of physicists. They still don't understand how this could be, but it's the case. Would God break the laws of physics for just this one person? Well, yeah. yeah, if this person were important enough, if in God's plan for humanity, this person had such a significance that this is what God wanted to do, yeah. It's like asking the question, would God create, are we important enough for God to have created the universe for us, this one-time event, this singularity called the Big Bang? Well, yeah. If it obviously happened once, it apparently broke the laws of physics then, because there were really apparently no laws of physics before, the cosmos existed, because the laws of physics applied to the universe. We don't know what laws of physics existed before the Big Bang. Okay, to me, this is kind of like a non-argument, because, it doesn't really answer anything. It just like, it just basically applies to a prejudice. Would God do this for one person one time? Well, who knows what God can do and wants to do? That's a whole other question. And does God have to do something over and over again for you to say, oh yeah, it did happen to Jesus? Because we have other resurrections after, And I guess a final point I'll make is Jesus' resurrection is not unique. It is Christian teaching that his resurrection is the beginning, because we will all be resurrected, good, bad, Christian, non-Christian, at the end of time. The belief is that when Jesus comes back, there will be a general resurrection where all of us will be reunited with our souls and bodies, and we will receive either reward or punishment for how we've lived our lives. Or another way to put this is that we will either be with God, for eternity, whether we want to, if we want to be with God, and if we don't want to be with God for eternity, we won't be. God will respect that choice. It's called hell. If he'll respect the choice if we want to be with God for eternity. It's called heaven. But that will happen to all of us. So the resurrection of Jesus is actually not a unique event. It's the first of a number of events. So those who say, God would do this for just one guy. Well, no, God's not going to didn't do it for just one guy, because he's going to do it for all of us who have ever existed. So it's not, in that sense, unique. Okay. So the cry was, we have seen physically the Lord. Jesus, who had really died in the flesh, whose dead body had really been buried, or not. If you just want to say his body was still on the cross, then hung on the cross for several days, but everyone seems to accept he was buried. Jesus was now appearing to some of his followers and was really alive in the flesh. If you don't understand this essential fact, then you won't understand Christianity or what will come after. The Gospels are not history books. They're not newspaper accounts of Jesus' ministry or the early church. They are concerned with telling the story of the greatest historical event and fact of all, which is the raising to life of Jesus from the dead. And so I give you this statement from the Catechism of the Catholic Church. That's what CCC means. The Catechism of the Catholic Church, number 638, where it says that the resurrection of Jesus is the crowning truth of our faith in Christ, a faith believed and lived as the central truth by the first Christian community, handed on as fundamental by tradition, established by the documents of the New Testament, and preached as an essential part of the Paschal mystery along with the cross. What is the Paschal mystery? Because I don't think I've given that to you, so I'll give it to you here. The word Paschal mystery. The word Paschal comes from the Hebrew word for Passover, the Passover of the Jews, which Jews celebrate every year, which commemorates their liberation from slavery in the land of Egypt. And it also commemorates ultimately God's revelation to them and making a covenant, a contract with the people of Israel. Not that he hadn't done it before, but kind of making a more formal, a more not established, that's not the word I'm looking for, a more major contract. Not that God had not made covenants before with the ancestors of the Israelites, but through Moses, God establishes the covenant with the people of Israel. Okay, the absolutely binding covenant of his law. And so what is the Paschal mystery? Well, Jesus suffered, he died, and he rose again during the time of the Passover, the celebration of the Passover that year. So that's what the Paschal mystery is. The mystery is his suffering, death, and resurrection. And it's a mystery because it has to be interpreted. I mean, the suffering and the death of the Messiah were certainly were problems to be interpreted and understood, as was the resurrection, which seemed to be a triumph of the Messiah, but was still not understood and had to be interpreted. So they're mysteries. They're things that we can understand, but need to be you have to kind of unload the meaning. unpack, as scholars like to use, but unload the meaning and interpret the meaning. So it is a mystery, and it's a mystery that happened during the Passover time, so it's called the Paschal Mystery. So the Paschal Mystery refers to these events, which are really one event, of the suffering, death, and resurrection of Jesus. This Paschal Mystery is what stands at the center of Christianity and of Christian belief. Okay. So I believe I will end there, and on Thursday, our next class, I should say, we will talk about the teachings of Jesus. One more point. Okay. Have a good day. God bless you all. Okay, it'd be nice if I could get this back. Okay. There we go.